Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lisa Sundstrom. I'm a professor of political science in the department here at UBC. I'm also our department's director of alumni engagement, which is why I'm helping to introduce this event tonight. It's wonderful to be here this evening for the 2022 Mark Zacher Distinguished Speaker Lecture. And I'm very excited to hear from our special guest speaker tonight, Roland Paris. So I'd like to start off by acknowledging that we're gathered here on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. In recent months, I've been particularly struck by how privileged I am to be permitted to live on this land in peace, while Ukraine and numerous other parts of the world are experiencing violent conflicts and instability. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to reside here temporarily on this territory, which has been a place of learning and passing down traditions for the First Nations of this area for thousands of years. On behalf of the Department of Political Science and the International Relations program at UBC, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. We're so happy that all of you have carved out time from your busy schedules to join us tonight. And we're also really thrilled to have this event in person for the first time since 2019. It's been 3 years since we've done this event in person. So that's exciting. We're pleased here to bring together students, alumni, faculty, and emeriti for the annual Mark Zacher Distinguished Visitor event. This annual lecture was launched in 2013 and made possible by key alumni and faculty who came together to honor Mark's legacy as a stellar academic and teacher. Mark was able to attend the first few years of this event organized in his honor until he unfortunately passed away in October 2014. Mark made an enormous impact on the department as a colleague and on his former students throughout their academic and professional lives as a mentor and role model. He's sorely missed by all of us who knew him. I'd like to say thank you to those who made this special lecture possible, not only the alumni and faculty donors who contributed to the fund to sponsor this series, but also to our staff members, Chris Fernandez, Brent Holmes, and Jeff Yupiton in the Political Science Department. Also Rashad Ali and Christine Lee in Arts Alumni Engagement, and also our undergraduate student organizations, the PSSA and URSA, for helping to spread the word about the event. Before I introduce Roland Paris, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the format for tonight's event. Following Roland's presentation, we'll have a brief question and answer period where we'll open up the floor for you to ask him questions. So please hold on to your questions until the end of his talk, and we'll try to get to you. After that, we'll hold a reception where there will be food and drinks and an opportunity to mix and mingle, including with alumni who have joined us here. So it's a good opportunity for current and recent students to connect with our alumni and others from the community who have joined us tonight. We're going to have, during the question and answer period, there will be a couple of roaming mics, people holding mics who will come when you raise your hand. They'll come and take your question from you. So now it's my pleasure to introduce one of the very brightest lights in Canadian scholarship on international affairs, Dr. Roland Paris. Roland Paris is a professor of international affairs and the director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. He's an associate fellow at Chatham House and a former foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada. His research on international relations has won numerous awards and citations, including the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. He also regularly analyzes foreign affairs for national and international media. In addition to serving in the Prime Minister's office, Professor Paris has held numerous positions in Canada's Foreign Ministry and its Privy Council office, and has received 3 awards for public service. His previous roles also include Director of Research at the Conference Board of Canada, the country's largest think tank, founding director of the Center for International Policy Studies, visiting fellow at Sciences Po in Paris and at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., assistant professor of political science and international affairs at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and global ethics fellow with the New York City-based Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. Among his advisory roles, he served on a 10-person group of international experts advising the Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and currently serves on the advisory committee to the Deputy Minister of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. Roland holds a PhD from Yale University, an MPhil from the University of Cambridge, and a BA from the University of Toronto. So as you can see from this distinguished history, he's an ideal visitor for Mark's Zacher program, as Mark's work centered on various areas of international organization and global governance. Roland is also ideally positioned to comment on the war in Ukraine and how it affects the existing international system in many respects, from regional and global security to global governance institutions outside the security realm. We've been waiting now for 2 years to have Roland join us in person. Originally, we had talked about this happening in 2020. We all know what happened. But for better or worse, this year seems like the ideal time to hear his views on one of the most acute crises Europe and the world have faced in many decades. So please join me in welcoming Roland Paris.
Thank you so much for that extremely generous introduction, and thank you for coming here tonight. I can't tell you how honored I am to be delivering the Mark Zacher lecture this year, and what a pleasure it is to actually be with people. It's nice to be out of the chair in my home office that I've been sitting in for 2 years, and it's especially nice to come to a different season, spring. I should tell you, yesterday when my plane was leaving Ottawa, it was snowing and our plane had to stop to be de-iced. So thank you for all of that. Thank you especially to Lisa and to the department and everyone who is hosting this event. It's quite meaningful for me. I admired Professor Zacher. I admired his scholarship, and I admired him as a person, as a man. He was intellectually open. He was a very generous soul who was devoted to his students, and he even took the time to counsel and mentor young scholars, like somebody who had just gotten his first professor job at the University of Colorado in Boulder 25 years ago, who welcomed very much his advice, and I'll never forget how kind he was to make the time to speak to me and give me advice. Of course, his academic work, as Lisa said, on international organization and global governance really couldn't be more relevant to the kinds of challenges that we're facing in the world today and to the subject of this talk, because, excuse me, he was fundamentally interested in how international cooperation could be built and sustained through institutions and rules, even in a world driven by conflict. In fact, one of his major publications, last major publications before he retired in 2003, was an article that has a special resonance for events that have recently taken place in Ukraine. That article traced the development of what he called the territorial integrity norm, or the basic principle that states should not simply use armed force to grab territory outside their own borders. And he showed how that norm had developed over centuries, but especially since World War II, in part because the experience of those wars had burned itself into the minds of policymakers and others, and they understood that attempts to change borders by force had caused calamitous wars, and that the principle of territorial sovereignty provided at least a measure of stability in global politics. It was a pillar of international order. And of course, he was right. And it's the existence of that norm that he described that helps to explain why Russia's assault, or at least partly why Russia's assault on Ukraine has been so shocking, particularly on a continent where the idea of a massive invasion by one country of its neighbor seemed like part of the distant past, seemed like part of the sad history of previous centuries. It seemed like part of a barbaric period that Europe, we hoped, we maybe even thought, had left behind. Of course, that's not the only shocking element of this war, and I should warn you right now that, as I was saying to a friend earlier today, this talk will be a little bit like a horror movie. It's going to be scary in the middle and I hope uplifting near the end. But over the last 2 months, we have witnessed so many unthinkable atrocities, including a clear pattern of deliberate attacks on civilians. In Mariupol alone, up to 20,000 civilians may have been killed so far. We just don't know. And we've seen millions of people fleeing their homes, sometimes dragging a suitcase in one hand and carrying a child in the other arm. Imagine the entire population of British Columbia, all 5 million people, suddenly having to flee Canada. And there are 8 million additional Ukrainians who have been forced from their homes and still remain in that country. That's the equivalent of every single person in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Nova Scotia. And that's in a country with a population of 43 million people, not much bigger than Canada. They're not being driven away, as others in the world have been, by natural disasters or the pandemic or an economic crisis. This is a case in which the responsibility for this massive tragedy falls to just one man, the president of Russia, who personally decided to launch an unprovoked war of conquest against his neighbor, with the apparent aim of decapitating the government in Kyiv, transforming Ukraine into a puppet state, and gaining permanent control over a vast swath of territory from the Donbass in the east all the way along the Black Sea coast. And even though Putin's initial invasion plan failed miserably, there's no sign that he's backing down. If anything, he seems to be doubling down. And so are we. So is the West. These are the things that I'd like to talk about tonight. Where does all this lead? Where does it lead Ukraine? What does it mean for relations between the West and Russia, and for the future of Europe, and also for our own country? Because I suspect that future historians will look back at this conflict as a turning point, at least the symbol of the end of the post-Cold War international order and the start of something different, which is still unclear, but maybe is just starting to come into focus. In fact, this transition has been underway for some time. The heady optimism of the period after the Cold War, the unrivaled dominance of the United States in international affairs, the sense that a new world order, as George W. Bush put it, was finally possible, those are all long gone. But sometimes it takes a shocking event for people and for countries to reorient their thinking. And that's the kind of psychological shift that I think that this war has brought about. Just take one example I'm sure you're all aware of, Germany, a country that since World War II has embraced, almost defined its identity as an anti-militarist society. And almost overnight, it decided to reverse decades of policy when its new chancellor announced that the country would immediately invest 100 billion euros in its military and would begin shipping heavy weapons to Ukraine, a decision that the German Bundestag earlier today endorsed by a lopsided vote of 568 to 100. Even neutral Switzerland has broken ground by imposing sanctions on Russia. And the European Union, which has long viewed itself as a normative power, has now become an arms supplier too, committing 500 million euros in weapons for Ukraine. And two previously non-aligned countries, Finland and Sweden, neutral since 1815, I think, are poised to apply for membership in NATO in the coming weeks. That seems very likely. These are all indications that leaders and people are thinking about European security differently now. The post-Cold War assumption that the continent had moved beyond wars of conquest, unfortunately, but realistically has been shattered. And it also illustrates that while history is a continuous flow of incremental change, sometimes there are moments of startling transformation when a realization sets in that the world is not the same. That's not just true for Europe, it's also true for the West's relationship with Russia. Because it now seems almost inevitable that no matter how the war in Ukraine unfolds, we are heading towards a new kind of Cold War with Russia. Everything appears to be pushing in this direction. Putin cannot afford to lose his war, his special military operation. He cannot afford for that to be seen to fail. But the fact is that Russia's own actions have virtually guaranteed that Moscow will face a hostile government in Kyiv for the foreseeable future. The war has done more. Putin's war has done more to forge a genuine sense of Ukrainian nationhood than perhaps anything in the country's history. And Western governments, for their part, will almost certainly continue arming Ukraine so that it can defend itself. I don't see that commitment weakening as the scale of civilian losses in this war becomes even clearer. Meanwhile, Russian troops in neighboring Belarus may never return home from their so-called exercises. And their permanent presence there threatens to isolate the three Baltic countries, which are all members of NATO. The alliance is currently working to reinforce its presence in those countries, including with additional troops from Canada. As you probably know, Canada leads the NATO battle group in Latvia. But the Russians will regard that reinforcement themselves as a threat, just as they will perceive Sweden and Finland joining NATO as a threat. And the Russians will also reinforce. That's part of the dynamic. Another part is that I can't really envisage Western governments lifting most of the sanctions on Russia, even when, if the Ukraine war ends, at least not while the man they have described as a war criminal, perhaps guilty even of leading a genocide, remains the president of Russia. All of these trends point towards a new kind of Cold War. But I'm afraid to say that this thing, whatever we call it, this period of tension, may be even riskier than the last one. I warned you that this was a bit of a horror show. But it's unfortunately the truth. During the original Cold War, the lines dividing Soviet and Western forces and the Soviet and Western blocs were relatively clear. Both sides went to great lengths to limit the risk of an isolated clash escalating into a larger, or God forbid, nuclear conflict. But the current war in Ukraine could spread more easily than people may think. Just in the last day, Russia cut off gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria. There were reports of attacks on Russian military targets on the Russian side of the Ukrainian border. And there have been mysterious explosions in the Russian-controlled eastern part of Moldova. What will the news be tomorrow or next week or next month as this war grinds on, as it is likely to do for some time. The possibility of an uncontrolled escalation must be in our minds and in the minds of our policymakers. Part of the problem also is that many of the measures that were introduced during the Cold War to limit these risks have since disappeared, and that includes a very complicated web of arms control agreements that the US and the Soviet Union negotiated over many years, some of which allowed for intrusive inspections so that each side could verify that the other side was complying. Today, there is one of those agreements still left in place, and it's scheduled to expire in 4 years. Meanwhile, in international airspace, Russian warplanes have been flying closer to those of NATO in recent years, sometimes passing within just a few meters of each other. Extremely risky. Another difference from the Cold War is that our societies today are much more interconnected, digitized, and therefore vulnerable to disruption and mutually vulnerable to disruptions in ways that they were not during the original Cold War. What if Russia decided to launch a serious cyber attack against the European and North American banking sector? It would seem like a kind of target that might be considered given the financial sanctions on the Russian financial sector. How would our governments respond? Would we be able to identify the source of this attack? And if the source was identified as Russian, how much pressure would our governments be under how much pressure would they be to retaliate in the physical world? Isolating Russia economically, which we are working to do, will also be much more difficult, not least because Russia will continue to benefit from its relationship with the world's second largest economy, China. Not to mention its relationship with many other countries that are effectively fence-sitting. They don't see that they have a dog in this fight, like India, which is currently buying Russian oil at a discount, processing it into fuels like diesel, and then reselling those fuels at a premium to an energy-hungry Europe. Taking a step back, these pressures, in my mind, are pushing us in a particular direction. And barring a dramatic change in Russian policy, which who knows, but I don't see, this is the new reality in Europe, and it's the new reality that's emerging between the West and Russia. I suspect, though, that Putin is hoping that the West will not be able to sustain its newfound unity and cohesion, and frankly, that is an open question. 6 months from now, the United States will hold midterm elections, which will almost certainly return more Republicans to the US Congress. And I guarantee you that the question that will animate talk shows from that moment until 2024 is whether Donald Trump or somebody like him can ride this momentum back to the White House. Even the possibility of a Trump victory will create a chill among US partners who will have to start thinking about what this might mean for themselves and for their security given Trump's behavior and treatment of them in the past. So that's another uncertainty in this emerging context. Now, I don't want to bring you too far down because I am going to transition to the good news, but we do not know what the second and third order effects of this war might be, and there will be many, and we could just pick one, for example, which is what will the effects of spiking energy and food prices be on international politics, on the internal politics of countries, even the internal politics of our own countries. France dodged a bullet last weekend in not electing Marine Le Pen president, but it's important to note that her historically strong performance was due in part to public frustrations about inflation. And these economic shocks come at especially difficult moment. 2 years into the pandemic, in the midst of supply chain disruptions, and with China now experiencing a COVID wave that will once again upend global shipping and the supply of goods. And we'll feel this too, not just by way of gas prices. Let me give you a little example. Because of the Ukraine war, the price of metals used to manufacture cars has skyrocketed. From the aluminum in the bodywork, to palladium for catalytic converters, to high-grade nickel for electric vehicle batteries. My wife and I have a 10-year-old car, and we've settled on a new model, only to find out that the waiting list is 4 years. I kid you not. But that's truly a first world problem, because the part of the world that's most vulnerable to spiking food prices in particular are countries in the Middle East and North Africa, where domestic food consumption relies heavily on imported cereals from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The last time food prices were this high was right before the Arab Spring. Or consider the global supply of fertilizers, which is, I'm sure, something that you consider every morning, evening. Brazil depends on potash fertilizer from Russia and Belarus, which together those two countries produce 40% of the world's potash. But the supply has been interrupted. Nothing is getting out of the Black Sea. And Brazil's giant and important soybean production may be at some risk. I expect you weren't anticipating hearing about soybeans tonight. Now, it's possible to get lost in the second and third order effects of this war and thinking about what all the reverberating implications might be. So let me take a step back now that I've mapped out the risks and return to the bigger question of what kind of world order seems to be emerging. And the answer to that question should remind us of why it's so important to stand up to Russia now, despite the complexities and despite the dangers. Because Putin has not only invaded his neighbor, he is in effect seeking to legitimize a vision of world order in which Russia has an uncontested right to declare other territories for all intents and purposes Russian. Any territory deemed to be part of the Russian world, to use that language that he has used, in effect an ethno-national realm of Russianness, regardless of the actual wishes of the people who might live there. It's a direct attack on what Mark Zacher called the norm of territorial integrity, or what we sometimes call territorial sovereignty. And if you read really closely what Putin has written and said about sovereignty in recent years, and for a recent research project, I read 10 years of Putin's speeches, translated into English, you may notice something strange. For him, a truly sovereign state seems to be one with a powerful collective will to achieve its full grandeur. A society that is spiritually united and led by a powerful leader who personifies and channels the, quote, inner energy of that society. Now, the converse is also true. In Putin's discourse, kind of upside-down discourse on sovereignty, societies lacking these sovereign attributes are inherently weak, degenerate, and worthy of contempt. They may even deserve to be dominated. On February 21st of this year, just 3 days before the invasion, while he was still adamantly denying any intention to move Russian troops into Ukraine, Putin gave an interesting speech which turned out effectively to be his rationale for war. And in it, he accused Ukrainian leaders of having, quote, replaced Ukraine's true sovereignty with what he called a corrupt and corroded Ukrainian sovereignty. It's as though invading Ukraine didn't violate that country's sovereignty at all, because Ukraine wasn't a real state. It wasn't sovereign in the way that Putin has redefined the term. He is essentially, through this argument and others, claiming that Russia has a right as a civilization, again his term, to treat the norm of territorial integrity as optional. And it's not at all clear what the geographical limits of this self-declared right might be. All of which raises a really fundamental question. What is the basis for international order? Is it made up of sovereign states as we understand the term? Or is it made up of civilizational empires? And it's an important question because Putin isn't the only national leader these days to be talking in ethno-national, civilizational terms. Xi Jinping certainly is. The leitmotif of his presidency has been the, quote, great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, a project that is fundamentally rooted in an ethno-national vision of Han-Chinese dominance, not only of China proper, but also of its neighbors, sometimes called, in the official parlance, peripheral countries. India's prime minister, to some extent, has been using this kind of civilizational language, too, in relation to Hindu nationalism. So has Viktor Orban, the recently re-elected prime minister of Hungary, who has long invoked mythical visions of Hungarian greatness rooted in religious unity and national purity, and then, of course, cast immigration as a form of, quote, self-immolation. And then, of course, there's Donald Trump, who, while he was president, described sovereign societies as having, quote, strong families and strong values and patriots willing to sacrifice and uphold their culture, faith, and tradition, or else face, quote, decay, domination, and defeat. It's no coincidence that people like Orban and Trump have been openly sympathetic to Putin, if not admiring of him. Part of the attraction seems to be the strongman leader itself, which has gone hand in hand with this resurgent ethno-nationalism. But Putin has also appealed for international support by casting himself as the defender not just of Russian civilization, but of Western Christendom, including against the supposedly pernicious effects of political liberalism. You may have noticed that Putin initially responded to Western sanctions by talking about being canceled, just like J.K. Rowling. It seemed strange, it seemed weird, but it made sense if you consider it as an appeal to culture warriors in the United States and elsewhere that effectively said, I'm on your side, I'm fighting your fight. But it's a harder sell, obviously, for Putin now, because the war has woken up so many people and so many governments about the challenges that we collectively face. And part of that challenge is the defense of, yes, democracy, both abroad and at home. Volodymyr Zelensky has held up a mirror to us. And in his plain-spoken way, he has demanded that we ask ourselves who we are and what we stand for. And the bravery of the Ukrainian people has forced us to confront the question, what are we going to do about it? It's been a wake-up call. No one would have wished for this war, but it's a wake-up call that we all needed. And, you know, paradoxically, this may be Putin's ultimate legacy, that after years of chipping away at international rules and norms, he got greedy, impatient, and reckless. He thought we would continue to look the other way. He was wrong. What he actually managed to do was to wake a sleeping beast. Now he's facing a more united and resolved NATO, the opposite of what he wanted. Russia will be weaker, a lot weaker, as a result of his invasion. The IMF estimates Russian GDP will shrink this year by 8.5% and that inflation will be over 21%. As you know, hundreds of international companies have withdrawn their activities from Russia. Russia, importantly, this doesn't get a lot of attention, but it will be and is being cut off from the high-tech goods, the high-tech equipment that it needs to sustain its own defense production or even to sustain and maintain its civilian airplanes. The Russian army has been mauled. Its weakness has been exposed. And Russia's journey towards becoming a junior partner of China has accelerated. That is what Putin has accomplished in 2 months of work. Heck of a job. Clearly, it was not what he was expecting. But we will need to sustain our own resolve while also being mindful of the risks that I described earlier. Resolve and restraint is what we need. The people who have underestimated Russia in the past have often done so to their own detriment. Adolf Hitler considered Russia a country that was a house of cards, just waiting to collapse. Napoleon confidently invaded with 500,000 soldiers, and 6 months later, he retreated with only 100,000 left alive. Now, these might seem like strange examples for me to mention in this context, but I mention it only because there are already hints of hubris in the Western response to Russia's military setbacks in Ukraine. When the US Secretary of Defense says that America's goal is not just to help Ukraine to defend itself, but also to weaken Russia, that actually plays into Putin's hands and into Putin's claim to his own people that the NATO is trying actually to destroy Russia. And of course, President Joe Biden's apparently improvised remark that Putin, quote, cannot remain in power, unfortunately, had the same effect. It's not in our interest to cast this as a contest between NATO and Russia or the West and Russia, because that's precisely how Putin describes it. He knows that in Russia and in many other places, memories of Western interventions and even the legacy of Western colonialism still resonate. So does the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and images from Abu Ghraib, and the use of torture. These have had a lasting impact on America's reputation and unfortunately also the reputation of the democratic West. And of course, there's the memory, very fresh, of Donald Trump's presidency. We don't need to list his transgressions, but describing African countries as S-holes probably did not enhance America's influence on that continent. You know, the old caricature of the ugly American is a rude smear, but let's be honest, Trump personified it. What we should be doing is redoubling our efforts to reach out to non-Western countries and making common cause with them wherever possible. Now, Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly has already been doing some of this. So has the Prime Minister in his phone calls, and for those of you who are really geeky enough to be checking the readouts of those calls that are posted on the Prime Minister's website, you will know that a lot of these calls have been happening. Probably the same number of people who have been thinking about potash right before this meeting. But this can't just be a short-term push, because Canada has a strong interest in building and sustaining cooperation with countries around the world, not just because we want to be able to leverage those relationships, not just because we're a trading country, but because we want to live in a world where the possibility of cooperation continues. That was the unifying theme of Mark Zacker's scholarship. We should all make it our own. It's the way for the West to renew its reputation in the world by making the case, for example, that human rights and the laws of war are not liberal or Western. They're human. You can bet that there are people in every country on this planet who are deeply shocked by what Putin has done in Ukraine. And that's certainly true in Canada. The Ukraine war has cut through the noise of our daily lives, and people seem to be aware that something fundamental is at stake. In my own Ottawa neighborhood, on our little residential block, I counted 5 Ukrainian flags hanging in front of people's homes. 4 if you exclude the one in front of mine. But we also need to understand that this war is not happening in isolation. It's a symptom of a world that's transforming, that is becoming more complicated and, yes, more dangerous. And that requires an adjustment in our own way of thinking, because we have lived through a very long period of remarkable peace, prosperity, and openness. We are still extraordinarily lucky, as Lisa said, to be living here. And I'm confident that Canada's future is bright, but we will need to work harder with our allies, with other countries, with anyone who is a willing partner to stave off the New World disorder. One of the preconditions for doing so, it's not an end in itself, but it's essential, is to reinvest in the tools of Canadian statecraft, which have been neglected for too long. Our military, our diplomatic service, and our development programs. Those are the tools that we will need to defend ourselves and our allies. That's an insurance policy. And also to build and strengthen partnerships with countries around the world. It's not naive to think that Canada can contribute to making the world a more peaceful and more just place. What's naive is to think that we can do it on the cheap. Let me conclude by noting that there's something else that I admired about Mark Zacher. It's that he was both a realist and an idealist. He understood that international relations is largely about power politics and that conflict is unfortunately endemic. But he also showed us in his work that progress is possible and that international cooperation can be built and sustained. This is a vision that we all need to make our own as we prepare for the world that's emerging rather than the one that we've known. Thank you very much. I really look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. That was a fantastic talk, so thought-provoking, and I'm sure our audience members have plenty of questions, so let's get right to it. We have a couple of roving mics here. So if you have a question to ask, please raise your hand and they will find you.
Oh. Hi.
Maybe if you can introduce yourself, that would be great too.
I'm an undergraduate student from UBC studying international relations, and thank you for that wonderful talk. I was wondering what role can or should regional organizations like the European Union play in preserving or maintaining security and stability in a new global order?
Well, European Union, because it is right there, has a particularly important role to play. I would say there's two ways of answering your question. One is about the European Union. The other is more generally about regional organizations. The European Union has a real challenge right now because, as I mentioned, it has historically thought of itself as representing a kind of transcendence of power politics, of the bad old days of power politics. That's why I said the European Union has tended to think about itself as a normative power. It kind of not really considered itself to be a geopolitical player even as the geopolitical contestation has been rising in recent years. Yes, the European Union has a common foreign defense security strategy, but it's really not that very developed yet. And so part of the role of the European Union is to maintain the cohesion of European countries and the political cohesion through this whole period. Part of its role is, in terms of countering Russia, it's a key actor with regard to economic sanctions. It is now also carving out a role for itself to be directly aiding Ukraine, even in more direct ways, and that's with financing arms, and that's a little bit, that's the surprising part. But over the longer term, I think that, you know, what the European Union represents remains core to what it is that has been violated by Russia's actions. And so the European Union can never truly become, and should never truly become or seek to become, just a geopolitical player. It does represent a set of values, and all of the countries that have joined the European Union, and this applies to a lesser extent to NATO as well, have committed themselves to those values of liberal democracy. They've all undertaken massive changes to their own new members after the Cold War, to their own systems of governance, to their own legal and judicial systems, to their own budgeting systems, in order to meet those standards of governance. So the European Union continues to represent that, and in that sense, it's also representing a set of values. But the larger question about regional organizations, I mean, this is a seismic event, as somebody was saying at lunch, and I think we're going to see international institutions shaking out in different ways. You know, the G20 finance ministers met the other day, and a number of countries, including Canada's representative, Chrystia Freeland, walked out when the Russian representative was speaking. The G20 leaders are supposed to be meeting in Indonesia later this year, and we don't know who's going to be there. It seems like maybe Joe Biden isn't going to go at all, not sure if Justin Trudeau would go. So does the G20 now fragment, or does it continue intact? It's just so hard to know how this is going to shake out. But I'll just conclude with one thought, which is that we're still going to need to have mechanisms of cooperation, even with countries that we have tense relations with, because first of all, we need to keep channels of communication open under all circumstances, but secondly, we have common challenges that we need to face together. We're never going to be able to deal with climate change unless we cooperate with China, for example. We're never going to be able to deal with the pandemic or a future pandemic unless we are cooperating, including with countries that we have tense relations with. And that's something else that I think that Canada can hold on to and can continue to practice in its foreign policy.
Hi. Hi, Roland.
Hi.
I'm Tom Coddington, the UK's Consul General here in Vancouver. Thanks again for a really insightful talk. I wonder if you'd seen the UK's Foreign Secretary's very similar call to action yesterday at Mansion House. I wonder if I could get your comments on a third element of it, which I didn't spot in your remarks. She joins your analysis that we should reinvest in the tools of statecraft, that we should widen the circle of our friends around the world and sort of invest in those relationships. But she also called on the G7 to think more deeply about our economic security and to consider ourselves almost as an economic NATO that kind of uses these tools that we've brought out of the toolbox to put pressure on Russia and deploys them more strategically around the world to kind of confront the kind of authoritarian behavior that we see reflected in Russia, but also in other places. I just wonder what you make of that as part of that call to action to confront the New World Disorder.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And for those of you who don't know, Tom Codrington, the Consul General of the UK here, has been here for 2 months. So I don't live here, but I'm going to say welcome on behalf of everybody in the room. I did not hear or read about that speech yesterday. I may have seen a news clip where she or somebody else was quoted saying that Ukrainians striking military targets in Russia were legitimate targets. I'm not sure if I got that exactly right. I was a little bit surprised at that quote. That's not helpful. But it sounds to me like we're thinking along similar lines. So it's part of the reason I'm always happy to hang out with British diplomats. Yeah, I mean, clearly the G7 is the kind of central table for what's often called like-minded countries, established industrialized democracies to coordinate their activities, and this is a perfect issue. This is the perfect issue for the G7 to be undertaking. All I would say here is that we have to walk and chew gum at the same time, by which I mean that while we are working to strengthen solidarity among democratic allies and partners and trying to place additional pressure and put additional costs on Putin and encouraging other countries, whether it's India or any other country, to try to contribute to that effort because of what Putin's invasion of Ukraine represents for any country in the world, we also need to be chewing gum. And the chewing gum is to be sustaining those relationships and to be trying to widen the tent. And in a way, there's a tension between those two things because one of them is, is coming together with your closest